which we saw previously. Thus, I think the harmony of the story mirrors the ultimate goal of national harmony. The harmonious structure of the book underlies its ambiance as well as its message, its aim, its objectives, personal, national, and theological. I want to draw your attention to some other features which also, I think, accentuate and underlie the harmony in the Megillah. And one is its careful use of language. In this very short book, several key words are consciously placed in order to highlight the reward that is given to Ruth for her acts of kindness. So if you look at this second chart that I brought for you here, which has Ruth's reward, Ruth's actions and Ruth's reward, what I want you to note here is how some of these words are really very rare words. They're not words that appear frequently in Tanakh at all, and yet they're used and placed in a very conscious and deliberate way in the story in order to highlight that one's acts always have recompense, that whatever it is that one does, one receives back again. So, for example, Ruth says in the first parak, or it says about Ruth in the first parak, Ruth dovkaba, right? Ruth cleaved to her, and of course, that is a very unusual description. And yet, later on in the story, Boaz will urge Ruth to cleave to his reaper women using the very same word, v'chod titbaki ne'im na'arotai. And this, of course, this urging is a gift. It's an act which embraces Ruth, which welcomes her into the fold, which welcomes her into the field, and which creates some sort of connection between Ruth and the reaper women. I mean, if you see her response to what it is that Boaz tells her to do, he says, well, you can cleave to my reaper women. And she says, Madua matzati chen beinecha la'kireni, v'anochi nochriya. Right? I am an alien. Why have you embraced me in this way? And the answer is really implied by the use of words. Now, Ruth, in her very famous speech to Naomi, her speech of loyalty, says to her, Al tifkei vi le'ozvech. Don't wound me by making me leave you. And later on, Naomi is going to protect her from the harm that might come to her from the young men in the field, which we know throughout the Megillah, that's the background of Sefer Shoftim, are actually very dangerous, right? Boaz also says, right? I told the men not to touch you, right? So we see what's going on in the fields of Beit Lechem during this volatile period. But of course, Naomi protects Ruth using the very same word that Ruth used in order to declare her allegiance to Naomi. She says, V'lo yifke'uvach b'sadeh acher. She says, I don't want them to harm you, right? So there's a give and a take here. Ruth's character in her insistence that she will not abandon Naomi is described also with the word ozvech, right? Al tifkei vi le'ozvech lashuv me'achoraich. Don't wound me by making me leave you. Now this word is used again in Boaz's description and praise of Ruth leaving her father and mother, who gadli kol asher asit et chamotech ba'asher azvi avich v'imech ve'eretz molatech. Of course, that reminds us of Avram again for another shir. But the sense is that Ruth is twice modified by the word azav, right? That she won't leave Naomi, but she will leave her previous life, her previous culture, and these acts receive due recompense when Boaz tells his workers that they should draw out some sheaves and leave them for Ruth to glean. The very same word. Shol tasholula min hatzvatim ve'azavtem ve'likta, right? And leave them there because she, of course, deserves that because she is the one that has left her previous life and that refuses to leave Naomi. And this really, I think this theme is played out, I think, in such a sophisticated and conscious way that it has to be noted. Ruth's speech of loyalty to Naomi, which is, of course, expressed among other ways in the words Ba'asher talini alin, right? Whither thou liest, I shall lie. Right? Of course, Boaz in Perek Gimel says to her, Lini halayla. Etc., etc. So again, we have a sense here that it's the act that Ruth did that eventually results in what is given back to her. And of course, Ruth's willingness to obey Naomi in chapter 3 when Naomi asks her to do something very difficult, right? Naomi, of course, asks her to lay her reputation on the line. Don't forget, Ruth is a Moabite, right? And we don't really take kindly to Moabites, and we certainly have our suspicions regarding their purity and their modesty. And Naomi says, well, just throw it all out the window and throw caution to the winds and get dressed and put on your perfume and go out to the fields and lie down next to Boaz, and he'll tell you what to do. As one can imagine, and I think it's really indicated in the text itself, that Ruth is not particularly thrilled by the notion. And of course, what she says to Naomi is, Kol asher tomri elai eseh. And the Eli is taken out of that sentence. In other words, it's not for me, I'm doing this. If you tell me to do it, I'll do it, but I'm not particularly enamored of this scenario. And of course, Boaz, later on in the very same chapter, is going to express similarly unhesitating compliance with Ruth's request in the very same words. Kol v'atabiti al tiri kol asher tomri selach. So there's, I think, a really strong sense here that the Megillah is making a strong point that no act goes unrewarded. Ruth gets exactly what she deserves because Ruth was kind to Naomi. She receives kindness from Boaz, and this kind of mirroring, I think, is meant to prepare us for the monarchy, which in its ideal form creates a society of justice and due recompense, and a sense that the good guys will prevail and the bad guys will be duly punished, right? And I think that that's really the sense that Migillat Ruth is trying to prepare us. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that the act of storytelling and the structure and the language that are used here is used very consciously in order to mirror the larger theme of the book. Now, this kind of linguistic mirroring occurs as well in describing the tension, the problem, the tragedy, and the resolution of that tension, and that really appears here in this third chart that I brought for you, which perhaps I'll leave to you to look over on your own. We mentioned the tigrena, right, the twice mentioned loss of name at the end of chapter 1, and the restoration of that name twice at the end of chapter 4. We have several other, I think, interesting linguistic connections between chapter 1 and the resolution in chapters 3 and 4. So, for example, Naomi says, Gam ha'iti alayla la'ish v'gam yaladti banim. And of course, this is a rhetorical statement. She, of course, means, even if I were with a man's eye, and even if I were to give birth. And of course, she does not believe she could give birth. And of course, the story ends with Yulad ben the Naomi, right, which is not a biological description, but an attempt to counteract the situation of Perek Aleph and the tragic story, the tragic narrative of Perek Aleph. Indeed, I think we can say, and this is, I think, one of the things that makes Migillat Ruth the master short story, is that no aspect of this tragedy is left unresolved. There are no strings that are untied, nothing's left hanging. Everything that was problematic in the beginning is resolved by the end. And the last point that I want to draw your attention to is the fact that this harmony is also found with respect to the characters in the story. Boaz and Ruth appear to be mirror images of each other. This is true linguistically. So, for example, Boaz is introduced as an ish gibor chayil, and of course Ruth is referred to by Boaz as ki yodea kol sharami ki Eshet Chayil at, right? So we have the Ish Gibor Chayil and we have the Eshet Chayil. This is true. This is true also in terms of well, there's one point on this chart that actually didn't make it in the chart. There's another description which is parallel between them, in which Ruth is described as Brucha at LaHashem Biti. That's in chapter 3, and Boaz is Baruch Hu Hashem, right, in chapter 2. So another parallel, these are two people who are blessed. Of course, Megillat Ruth is the story that resolves the problem of Sefer Shoftim, which ends with curses, right? Sefer Shoftim ends with Arur Ha'ish Asher Yiten Et Bito Levinyamin, right? Cursed be the man who perpetuates Binyamin. So we end Sefer Shoftim with the story of the demise of the Jewish people as they are known, right? Because, of course, the loss of Binyamin is the demise of the Jewish people, and that comes in the form of a curse. And so Megillat Ruth is also about the restoration of blessing. And I think it's very significant that in our two middle chapters, in one chapter we have the blessing of Boaz, and Boaz, by the way, is blessed 3 times in chapter 2, right? Once by his Kotzrim, Yivarech Hashem, once by Naomi without realizing who he is, when she says, Yihi makirech baruch, and the third time when she recognizes that in fact it's Boaz who has done all this kindness to Ruth, and she describes him as Baruch Hu LaHashem. And then of course Ruth is also Brucha LaHashem. And of course the union between these two people is meant to create what? Well, the Ish Chayil marries the Eshet Chayil, and what do they bring about? A child who is described as Aseh Chayil Be'Ephrata, right? That's what we're looking for. We're looking for that kind of monarchy. The man who is blessed to God and the woman who is blessed to God brings about a union, brings about a monarchy that is supposed to bring blessings back to the people. And the next story where we have a concentration of blessings, I'm going to skip over for a moment Chana, which is also part of this background of the monarchy. But the next story is really the story of David bringing the Aron to Yerushalayim, in which he simply scatters blessings as he walks. And the next story in chapter 7 of Shmuel Bet, where David wants to build the Beit HaMikdash, he wants to build the Beit LaHashem, which is described there as a Beit which is filled with blessings, which is going to bring blessing to the people. So you have the blessed man and the blessed woman who together build the monarchy, which is meant to restore blessing to the nation. Of course, this is true conceptually as well, this mirroring of these two characters, and I'm drawing now to a close. Ruth, of course, is described as hardworking. She is described as Vat'amod me'az haboker ve'ad ata v'tilaket basadeh ad ha'arev, right? Min haboker ve'ad ha'erev. And of course, Boaz, the wealthy landowner, is zoreh et goren haseorim halayla. He's working at night. He comes to the field, even though he has no obligation to be there. The hardworking man mirrors the hardworking woman, and of course, what is the name of their child? Oved. Right? This is not a coincidence. This is, I think, the formula for good kingship, for successful kingship, for kingship that won't be corrupted by tyranny. Of course, it is the king who serves the nation, who is the king that doesn't see his power as some sort of a way to further his own interests. And we can, of course, forget the story of David and Bathsheba, which begins with David not going to war and taking a nap and a stroll on the roof, right? That's not the Oved. The principle of the Oved has to underlie the story of the kingship. The king has to regard himself as a servant of the people. And the final mirroring that I want to draw your attention to is, I think, the most crucial one of all, is that we have these two characters whose selfless kindness is defined in a very particular way, and that is, of course, they are both described as Oseh Chesed et hachayim ve'et hametim, right? They do kindness with the dead, right? About Ruth, it is said, Yas Hashem imachem chesed kasher asitem im hametim ve'im adi. Naomi is speaking both to Ruth and Orpah at that point, that they did kindness with the dead, and this is the same way that Naomi describes seemingly Boaz, although it could be she's describing God there in Perek Bet, but for our purposes, I think that the deliberate ambiguity allows us also to see Boaz as a referent here of Naomi's description. She says about Boaz, Baruch Hu LaHashem asher lo azav chasedo et hachayim ve'et hametim. Blessed be God, blessed be him to God who did not leave his kindness either in terms of the living or the dead. And of course, what is chesed that one does with the dead? We call it chesed shel emet. It is chesed which expects nothing in return. There is nothing in return that one could get for that chesed. It is the kind of chesed that is self-nullifying. It is the kind of chesed that doesn't regard oneself as part of the formula. And this is both true about Boaz, who does some sort of Yibum-like act. This is not Yibum, but it's a Yibum-like act, which is, of course, perhaps one of the most selfless mitzvot that we have in all of our mitzvot. And, of course, Ruth, who is constantly taking herself out of the picture and who always sees herself as an empty vessel in order to give over to Naomi. This is the definition of both of these characters, the people who do chesed im hametim, and of course the denouement of all of this is the child who is born of this union, which encompasses the qualities of the mirror image parents, in order to produce a line of kingship which is designed to create a king with genetic predispositions towards certain traits, which can produce monarchy which bestows harmony upon the land